Well, Paul, good morning, and thank you for making your time to share with us.
My pleasure.
The greatest excitement here at STGCC here in Singapore. Tell us a little bit more about your upcoming work that's in progress right now. Any plans for collaboration or with Asia and the West?
Well, one of the neat things about how comics are done these days is we use artists from all over the world. So I just came off a long run of Legion of Superhero stories with an artist named Yildiray Çınar from Istanbul. So I've just been, I don't know, that's not this corner of Asia, but last I looked, that counts as being over the line. It would be great to work with some artists from this area. I did a ton of work early in my career with artists from the Philippines. Had a lot of fun working with them. Fred Carrillo, Jerry Talayak were collaborators at different times, and got to work as an editor with people like Nestor Redondo and Alfredo Alcala, some of the greats from South Asia. So I look forward to the opportunity to do that again. Right now I'm writing about 4 comic projects for DC. Legion of Superheroes with an artist named Francis Portela, who's based in Spain. A series called The Huntress with Marcus Bowe, who's an American. A Legion miniseries, Legion Secret Origins, with, why am I blanking on his name? Absolutely terrible. I apologize. The train has completely gone on me. I have his pages to balloon this afternoon. So, Casey, and also an American, and then a Batman series with Dennis Cowan. So who knows what the next thing will be? Maybe it will be someone from this area.
So, wouldn't there be any compromises between the characters and the feel of creating these guys? Were there any challenges when you create the story with those guys internationally?
You start out with a certain concern when you're working with an artist who doesn't share your language to make sure that the communication works. As a writer, particularly in comics, a lot of times you use idiom in your art direction, and you want to make sure that that idiom is something that doesn't mistranslate to the artist, doesn't confuse him, doesn't make it more difficult. It's much easier today to work with an artist from far away in the era of Google than it was when I started writing comics. When I began writing comics and you wrote a script for an artist in the Philippines, for example, if you said, and the character drops a letter in a mailbox, you didn't really know whether or not they knew what a generic American mailbox looked like, or whether they'd have in their reference file a British post box, which isn't that similar, but it's not the same thing, or some other perfectly natural misread. Now, it takes about a second for the artist to look it up online. They don't have to run to a library. And if it's something very specific that you want them to do, you just look it up yourself, embed the URL in your script, and say, look, it doesn't have to be this, but this is what I had in mind. In my recent Huntress script, the storyline is set in Italy, Naples and Pompeii and that area largely. And I had a mobster who had a particularly nice villa. So I spent 5 minutes looking online at the kind of villa I envisioned him doing, and I tossed that at Marcus, who was drawing the story, and Was it useful inspiration? I don't know. But what he ultimately drew was something that was very much his own, but certainly in tune with what I was hoping for. So you have some of that as a challenge. You also have the great opportunity, particularly on scripts like The Legion, which is a science fiction series set 1,000 years in the future, that you can draw on a wider kind of experience. You know, in any culture, you get embedded in certain ideas of what the conventional wisdom of what the future will be. And that tends to start with an extrapolation from your present circumstance. Well, if you walk around Singapore, the architecture of Singapore is extraordinarily different than the architecture of New York. They're both island cities, they're both very modern cities in many ways, they're both very vertical cities. Singapore has a willingness to use a little more land around its tall buildings and a little more, I'll call it humor, in its stylization. So whether it's the three towers of the sands with the kind of spaceship sitting on top of it, or even the kind of arc that the Mandarin Oriental cuts, that would be very rare for New York, which is a very grid-oriented city. So if you wanted to set a story in a Singapore of 1,000 years from now, it would kind of help to actually look at what Singapore is. Or if you wanted to invent a planet that had an entirely new architecture, you might say, well, here's what Singapore looks like. Imagine what they could do with 1,000 years more of technology. Could you have an entire city connected on the top like the sand, so that it was envisioned Stonehenge composed of skyscrapers with a continuous band circling around the top of glass or something? I don't know, I'm making this up. But you couldn't begin to have that kind of conversation with an artist, and it becomes richer when the artist has visual ideas influenced by their own culture, their own environment. There's more in the world than any of us get to see.
So, speaking about vision, is that how you would see Singapore for your future projects? Is there any a prospect that you might engulf in?
Oh, I think it would be very surprising if I didn't set something in Singapore in the Legion material. I mean, it's very cool. I'm not the most traveled American, but I've traveled to a fair amount of the world, and many of my stories include iconic things that I visited, because it kind of goes into the Velcro brain and it sticks there, and it's like, oh, that would be neat. The Tower of London. Could the Tower of London still be standing 1,000 years from now? Are there still going to be ravens hopping around on the lawn of the tower, as the mythology says that if the ravens ever leave, there'll be no England anymore? So that showed up in a Legion story many years ago after the, I guess, second time I had visited England. Places that I haven't been, but just that I have friends. I was telling you about a model gal I know who's Taiwanese, and after a lunch or a dinner with her one evening, I was starting a new Legion store, and was, I could set this in Taiwan. They're really good at manufacturing computer equipment. Maybe that'll still be true 1,000 years from now. I need to do a story with a raid on a robot manufacturing plant. Let's design Taiwan so 1,000 years from now it's half factory as an island, and the other half is like nature preserve. And you have fun with it. So Singapore is now in my data bank, and I would certainly expect to make some good use of it. Whether you guys will like what I do to it, often that involves, let's say, someone coming and trying to destroy the place, or playing pick up sticks with the sand towers. These aren't necessarily cheery things when you're in a comic book story, but but it's fun.